The cold kitchen floor sent jolts of sharp, icy discomfort through my body as I moved cautiously, inching my way forward. Every creak, every faint groan of the old house seemed amplified in the tense silence, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, listening, waiting. My palms pressed into the cold linoleum, and with each shuffle, I felt the night close in around me like a suffocating cloak. The persistent tapping from the front door, though muted now by the walls, never faltered. Whoever was out there wasn't going anywhere, and that thought alone sent shivers down my spine. Reaching the kitchen window, I hesitated. My heart pounded so violently that I feared the person outside might hear it, might feel the vibration of my fear through the very walls of the house. For a moment, I wanted to retreat, to crawl back into the safety of my mother's bed, pull the blankets over my head, and pretend this was all a nightmare. But deep down, I knew there was no escaping this. If I didn't face whatever was waiting at the door, it would eventually find its way to me. I slowly rose to my knees, the cool surface of the kitchen counter providing a solid, albeit cold, support. I paused for a heartbeat, my breath shallow, my mind racing. The window ahead loomed like a barrier between the known and the unknown, a thin veil separating me from whatever horror stood outside. A flicker of doubt crossed my mind. Did I really want to see? Did I really want to confirm the terrifying presence that I could already sense was there? With painstaking caution, I raised my head just enough to peer through the bottom edge of the window, keeping myself low. The moonlight outside was dim, but enough to illuminate a shadowy figure standing by the door. My blood ran cold. There, in the pale glow of the moon, was a man, tall, unnaturally still, and cloaked in darkness. His entire body was covered in black, from the hood that obscured his face to the long, flowing coat that made him seem like an extension of the night itself. The way he stood, facing away from the door, made it feel as though he wasn't just waiting, he was listening, like he was aware of everything happening within the house, including my every move. I stared, breathless, barely able to comprehend what I was seeing. His figure was larger than life, casting an elongated shadow that seemed to writhe and shift on the ground, distorting as it mixed with the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood there, as if time itself had frozen around him. His posture wasn't just still, it was unnaturally rigid, too perfect, as though he was a statue brought to life. I strained to catch a glimpse of his face, but the hood cast deep shadows over his features. I couldn't make out his eyes, but I felt his gaze nonetheless, an oppressive, suffocating sensation, like he was staring directly through the walls and into my very soul. There was no mistaking it, he knew I was there, watching him from the kitchen. Suddenly, the figure shifted slightly, just enough to make my breath catch in my throat. The subtle movement, though slow and deliberate, carried with it a weight of menace that made my skin crawl. My body wanted to run, to flee from the window, but I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear and curiosity. What was he waiting for? Why hadn't he left? And why wasn't he knocking anymore? Just as these questions swirled in my head, something even more chilling happened. Slowly, as if performing some dark ritual, the man turned his head toward the window where I crouched, hiding in the shadows. I froze, my body stiff with terror. Even though I couldn't see his face clearly, I knew he saw me. The air in the kitchen seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping as though the night itself was seeping into the house through the walls. I stared at the figure, my heart hammering in my chest, praying that he would turn back around, that he would go away. But instead, the man took a step closer to the door, his movements unnervingly smooth, like a predator closing in on its prey. I had to fight the urge to scream, to flee into my mother's room and beg her to make it all go away. But I knew that if I made a sound, if I gave any indication that I was there, something terrible would happen. The weight of that realization sank in, pressing down on me with a heaviness that felt unbearable. I was caught in a silent standoff with the man at the door, and I had no idea how it would end. The next few moments stretched into what felt like an eternity. The man stood there, facing the door again, but I could sense he hadn't forgotten about me. My pulse raced, my mind spiraling with desperate thoughts. Who was he? What did he want? Then, without warning, a sound broke the oppressive silence, 3 slow, deliberate taps on the window. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. The man hadn't moved, but somehow, the sound had come from him. It was a soft, almost gentle tapping, but it sent waves of terror crashing through me. It was as if he was toying with me, letting me know that he was fully aware of my presence. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He was in control. I was trapped in this nightmare, and he was calling the shots. I backed away from the window, my legs trembling. The walls of the house, once familiar and comforting, now felt like they were closing in on me. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside seemed to be part of the man's twisted game. I didn't know how much more I could take before I broke. In a blind panic, I stumbled backward, knocking into the counter behind me. The sound of the impact seemed to reverberate through the entire house, louder than the tapping had been, louder than anything I'd ever heard. I was sure the man had heard it too. But when I looked back at the window, he was gone. Desperation surged within me, a primal, uncontrollable force that I could no longer contain. It exploded out of me in a scream, loud, raw, and filled with a terror so profound that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. I screamed not just to break the silence, but as if my voice alone could banish the darkness that had crept into my world. It was a scream for survival, a desperate cry from a child who had come face to face with something far more sinister than any nightmare could ever conjure. The sound of my own voice echoed off the walls, bouncing back at me, intensifying the horror of the moment. My scream seemed to hang in the air, refusing to dissipate, as though the house itself was absorbing my fear, holding onto it, amplifying it. My throat burned, and yet I couldn't stop. It was as if screaming was the only way to stay connected to reality, to remind myself that I was still alive, still capable of making sound in a world that had suddenly turned eerily silent and cold. Within moments, my mother burst into the room, her bare feet slapping against the floor as she rushed toward me. Her eyes were wide with panic, her face pale, drained of all color. I could see the confusion and fear etched into her features as she scanned the room, searching for the source of my terror. But how could she understand? How could she grasp the gravity of what had just happened when it had already vanished, leaving no trace except the pounding of my heart and the echo of my scream? "Que pasa? Que sucede?" she asked frantically, her voice thick with worry as she knelt beside me. But the words caught in my throat. My mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I could only point a trembling finger toward the window where the man had stood just moments before. My hand shook uncontrollably as I gestured toward the spot, my mind still reeling from the encounter. Together, we turned to look, my mother's grip tightening on my shoulder. But when our eyes met the glass, the figure was gone. The moonlight poured through the window, casting faint shadows across the floor, but there was no trace of the man who had been there. He had disappeared, as though he had never been there at all. My mother's relief was palpable. She exhaled a long, shaky breath and pulled me close to her chest. I could feel the rapid thudding of her heart against my back as she held me tightly. "Fue solo una pesadilla," she whispered, her voice soft but strained. "Solo un mal sueño, cariño." But I knew better. This wasn't a dream. The man had been real, and I could still feel his presence, lingering in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. My mother's embrace, warm and protective, was comforting, but it couldn't erase the cold dread that had settled deep within me. Even as she stroked my hair and whispered soothing words, a part of me remained frozen in that moment, staring into the blackness where the figure had stood, wondering what his intentions had been. As my mother coaxed me back to bed, the house seemed eerily still, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for something more to happen. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive, heavy with the memory of those quiet, deliberate taps on the glass. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't gone far, that he was still out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to return. Even as I lay back down beside my mother, her arm draped protectively over me, my mind raced with questions that had no answers. Who was he? Why had he come to our door in the dead of night? What did he want? I tried to calm myself, to tell myself that it was over, that my screams had driven him away. But the unease gnawed at me, a growing sense that this was far from over. I stared up at the ceiling, watching the faint patterns of moonlight shift and change as the night wore on. My mother had already drifted back to sleep, her soft breaths filling the room with a steady rhythm that should have been comforting. But I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, I saw him again, standing there in the darkness, his face hidden beneath the hood, his figure looming like a shadow that could slip through walls. What if he came back? What if my screams hadn't scared him away, but had only delayed the inevitable? The thought gripped me with icy fear. I couldn't shake the image of him reaching for the door, or worse, trying to find another way in. My mind spiraled with dark possibilities. What if he had more sinister intentions? What if he had wanted to harm us? What if, at that very moment, he was somewhere nearby, planning his next move? The once familiar sounds of the house, its creaks and groans, the wind whistling through the trees outside, now filled me with dread. Each sound felt like a warning, a reminder that danger could still be lurking just beyond our walls. I clung to my mother, as if her presence alone could shield me from the unknown, but even her embrace couldn't banish the fear that had taken root in my heart. The night dragged on, and though everything seemed to have returned to normal, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. That sense of safety, of being untouchable in the warmth of my parents' bed, had vanished, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability. No matter how tightly I clung to my mother, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world outside our home had become a darker, more dangerous place. Eventually, exhaustion began to take its toll, and my body relaxed against my will. My eyelids grew heavy, and though I fought to stay awake, my mind started to drift. The last thing I remembered before sleep finally claimed me was the image of the man, standing in the moonlight, his figure frozen in place like a sentinel of the night. But even in sleep, the terror followed me. My dreams were filled with shadows, with tapping on windows, with faceless figures lurking just out of reach. I tossed and turned, haunted by the memory of that night, knowing deep down that the man was still out there, waiting.